Sarah Parshall Perry is the Vice President and Legal Fellow at Parents Defending Education. And we're going to talk with her about, I was just talking about education just a moment ago, Sarah. And here in Oregon, all we need to do is throw more money at the public schools, and then we're going to get smarter. We'll learn how to read. We'll learn how to cipher, do mathematics, things like that, and everything will be just fine. How are you this morning?
That's it. I'm doing really well. Good to be with you, Bill.
Yeah. The latest here, and I just mentioned this to you briefly, there's a House bill that wishes to double down on teaching kids how to read. And older listeners here, and I'm in my early 60s. I don't know how old you are, Sarah. I never ask a woman their age, that kind of thing. But I'm assuming you're a woman, but I didn't mean to misgender you if that's the case.
Once again, you could have misgendered me, but, thankfully I am someone who has not been lost to reason ever by the transgender juggernaut.
So good.
You assumed correctly.
All right, so you are not then, you're not down then with the transgender turtle who is running parts of the Oregon Health Authority section. You heard that story? Boy.
No, but nothing would surprise me.
Yeah. Well, I know that what is happening here in the state legislature, they want to double down on reading. And they're saying, hey, the kids are still having great difficulty reading. And people of a certain age, that would include me and many of my listeners, many of us were taught by our parents to read. And we were taught to sound out the words. We were effectively hooked on phonics before there was a hooked on phonics program. And I was reading at a fourth grade level, even in first grade, and always did well in school for that reason. It is the key to unlock it. Why does it seem to be so difficult to get kids to read? Does PDE get involved in stuff like that, or is it just embedded in the system and the kids have gotten dumber? I'm starting to wonder.
It's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of both. I think what we're looking at is an expenditure that is having a decreased yield for all of the money that's been thrown at so-called education for the past series of decades. Since its initiation in 1979, this has been a losing experiment. The Department of Education has only gotten bigger, and National Assessment of Education Placement scores have only gone down. Remember, we spent, during the COVID pandemic, billions of dollars, $200 billion in additional education funding during COVID-19. We actually saw substantial learning losses that typifies the complete ineffectiveness of the current federally driven model. And it's complicated by the fact that we've seen government initiatives specifically driven toward critical race theory and critical gender theory, which, as you know, have absolutely nothing to do with getting kids to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, science, history, civics. These absolutely have taken away the substantial loss of potential learning opportunities. And what we've seen now is lower educated children who are more indoctrinated, and they are actually graduating, many of them, at or below their actual reading level. In fact, I have just moved recently out of the state of Maryland, and now I'm a resident of the free Commonwealth of Virginia, thank goodness. But in 2023, 13 Baltimore, Maryland high schools had 0 students who tested proficient in mathematics. It's not just reading, it's math as well, and it's because too much money has yielded too much politics at the local level, and we're taking away precious learning time in favor of pushing radical ideologies that do nothing but divide students.
What role is the liberalism of teaching colleges? What role does it play in this one? Because you look at the educational system here, Sarah. And I know you're female, so I'm not making a bag on all females, all right? But the educational system is largely controlled by women, and most of all, white liberal women. Would you agree with that with that assumption? First off,
no. I would say, first of all, that's 100% accurate. And what happens is, for some reason, we find women, and perhaps it's the way that we're wired, we could be more relational, we could be more empathetic. And so causes that lean towards social justice narratives, like transgenderism, like critical race theory, and inherent bias or privilege or racism are those kinds of policies, they're those kinds of narratives that are particularly effective in sort of targeting.
So it attracts them to the profession? Would that be a way of putting it? That
I think that's it. We still see substantially more female teachers than we do more male teachers, and the role of these teaching colleges, they have always been lost to conservative thought, but particularly so in this environment when we know many of the colleges and universities that actually deal with programs like social work or education are spending disproportionately on these particular types of bias-led programs. So, in fact, we just released our report on social work and just a few days ago, these grants that were going into the states, 19 states received more than $100 million in education grant funding. 25 colleges and universities received these grants. We're looking at classes like Cal State Fresno's Theories of Diversity and Oppression, University of Anchorage, Alaska Anchorage, Master of Social Work program dedicated to, quote, advancing human rights, engaging in anti-racist, anti-oppressive social work justice practice. Florida International University, their Project DIG, focusing on recruiting and retaining credentialed mental health providers from diverse backgrounds and anti-racist and anti-oppressive frameworks in education and social work. Indiana University, Diversity, Human Rights, and Social Justice coursework. I could go on and on. These 25 colleges and universities who are receiving these grants, gearing up young professionals for social work and teaching enterprise, are actually spending taxpayer dollars to radicalize them before they are sent into public education classrooms.
Boy, the only thing that's missing is the shaved head and the power fist raised. You know, that kind of thing.
You got it. Well, and don't forget the nose ring, Bill.
Oh, the nose ring. Pardon me. The nose ring too. Sarah Parshall Perry, once again, Vice President and Legal Fellow at Parents Defending Education, and it's defendinged.org. Now, there were $100 million of taxpayer funding, going to push these social justice warrior kind of grants throughout the system. And something tells me that there may be a lot more where that came from. Is DOJ discovering more of this, and where do you see this headed in the current administration, especially with their desire to close the Department of Ed?
Yeah, you know what? I think that what the president has done is an excellent first step. The executive order that we saw come out, and what I loved was actually how he titled the executive order. It is a empowering parents, states, and communities executive order to improve education outcomes. He actually leads with parents. As somebody who is a parent of 3 kids, that's incredibly gratifying to see. I was also former senior counsel in the Civil Rights Office at Department of Education during his first administrative term. So I feel very passionately about the cause of public education. I don't want to cede it to the left. I think culturally, when conservatives say, we're going to throw up our hands, send everyone into parochial schools, private schools, charter schools, or homeschool, that's not always feasible. In fact, more than 90% of American school kids go to public education outlets. So we have to be practical with the resources we have. But I will tell you, the waste, fraud, and abuse that's being discovered through DOJ is so gratifying to somebody who recognized exactly how poor the outcomes were for as much money as we were spending. We were discovering individuals who were holding book clubs on Ibram X. Kendi's books on inherent racism and bias and how to be an anti-white ally during federal government paid time. That was the kind of conduct that was transpiring behind the scenes. And what I love is the second portion of this executive order also directs that programs or activities still receiving any federal funding will not advance DEI or gender ideology. Why? Because quite simply, those are violations of federal civil rights law. That's a violation of Title VI when you're discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion, or inherent bias or racist privilege. And it's a violation of Title IX when you're promoting gender ideology because it naturally discriminates against biological women in favor of men who feel like women. So this is an administration that wants to make sure they are cutting off the federal tap for individuals who are promoting civil rights violations. We are already spending too much of taxpayer resources. We have spent now, since 1979, 245% more per pupil, and we've received 150% less in outcomes. That is an unconscionable balance. But I think this Department of Education under this administration, pulling the tap and figuring out ways to send these core responsibilities to other executive agencies is the best possible outcome we've seen to date.
Sarah, is there any way, because I'm kind of mixed on the Department of Education shutdown. I know it's bloated, filled with waste and abuse, and frankly, filled with Marxists. Okay, but that being said, here it is. If you're going to reform a huge agency like this and actually get better educational outcomes, there was a part of me that was hoping that. And let me just put it this way. I'll just I'll kind of do this informally. President Trump comes into office. President Trump essentially is daddy, all right? And we have the school systems that are run by lots of women with really big daddy issues, okay? I think it's kind of where we are right now. Just when there was the need in some cases for daddy to come in here and spank some people and get some discipline into the educational process, I feel in some ways that it may not necessarily help a blue state like Oregon, which even though we have all these red states and purple or purple counties and red counties here, we're still dancing to the tune essentially of lots of women in education with daddy issues. And President Trump's reform, is that going to affect us? Will it help us or hurt us, or will we just be able to double down on daddy issues here? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because this executive order is just the beginning of a very, very long process. Remember, the Department of Education can't fully be dismantled without congressional involvement.
And that's true, and that's good. He even notes that, but he can certainly reduce it to the point where it almost doesn't work. It doesn't do nearly, or doesn't do all that much, right? It's there in name only, really.
Right. And what I know to be the case is that certain federal functions cannot be unilaterally undone. And we know that there are federal civil rights laws that, for example, have to be followed. Those would either be sent to Department of Justice for enforcement or to another enforcement agency. But that's a critical federal function. Another critical federal function is making sure that we are collecting data and we are holding national placement scores accountable for receipt of any federal funding, right? We know, obviously, that is one of the things, the National Assessment of Education Placement Scores and the annual report to Congress, which I worked on myself during my time in the Department of Education. There has to be some federal accountability for making sure that scores are being tracked, civil rights are not being violated, and that we are continuing to see an outcome commensurate to what we are investing. As long as we are sending any federal taxpayer money to these particular schools, and remember, there's also federal, in addition to federal civil rights privacy protections, there are federal student privacy protections as well. FERPA, PPRA, ESEA, which allow things like, for example, parents to come in and observe their child's classroom, to examine their child's curriculum, to examine their child's educational record. We want to make sure that federal laws are being enforced at the federal level, because otherwise we're getting a lot of nefarious outcomes at the state and local level. If, for example, you've got state and local prosecutors or state and local attorney generals or solicitor generals who don't necessarily feel that they want to follow federal law, that's an outcome that is better handled at the federal level in the bright disinfectant light of sun, where everybody can watch what's transpiring and who's being held accountable.
All right. As an example, you were mentioning civil rights law. Civil rights law was there to defend men and women's, or boys and girls, civil rights. It was not to defend the rights of the island of misfit humans to You like that term, huh? I've been using that term for a number of years here.
I do. I'm very impressed.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just remember, it's from the, nobody wants a Charlie in the box, that old Christmas story, way years ago. But the Island of Misfit Humans deal. Civil rights law was not about a guy pretending to be a woman because he feels like a woman to be able to go and just kick all the women out of their own locker room. Okay, right?
100%.
So is that where I think a lot of the civil rights enforcement is going to be coming down to in the Trump administration? Because Oregon is doubling down on the Island of Misfit Humans. We know that right now.
As is Maine, absolutely. Well, I can tell you that a number of these particular states and state educational agencies, for example, like the Maryland or the Maine Principals Association, or San Francisco State, San Jose University, all of these that are still recalcitrant on the issue of biological distinctions between male and female, who are holding fast to what they seem to think is superior state and local law, but both, of course, are in violation of federal law. The Department of Education is making sure that it is launching what are called directed investigations into these particular educational agencies, whether they are state or whether they are local, whether they are athletic associations, or whether it's the Maine Principals Association that oversees all of Maine's educational outlets itself. But San Jose State, UPenn, University of Maine, Massachusetts Interscholastic Association, and others, they are all being investigated, and that's quite a bit of federal funding on the line for them. Maine itself, for example, receives $250 million a year for federal funding. That's a lot of money. $250 million is a lot of money to stake on your ability to pretend you don't know what a biological woman is, and allowing trans-inclusive sports to continue in violation of federal law. Remember, under the Biden administration, we were entertaining this ideological circus. No more. A federal judge has struck down the Title IX regulation under the Biden administration. He vacated it for the entire country. It's in a state of suspended animation. It is not having any effect whatsoever. We're back to male and female on the federal level, and yet states like Oregon and states like Maine are continuing to double down. This is why federal civil rights enforcement is so important, because you will get states like Oregon, California, Michigan, Minnesota, Maine, all of whom will say, we're going to stick to state anti-discrimination law and our own regulations on gender identity in violation of federal law, and we're just going to say things, as Maine Governor Janet Mills did to the president's face himself a few weeks ago, we'll see you in court. Well, that day in court is most definitely coming now that we know that at least 6 federal investigations have been launched, and I think that's entirely appropriate based on their ideological positioning.
All right. How long do you think it'll take for the federal gun side, when it comes to education and these issues we've been talking about, ends up being leveled with both barrels, let's say, at the state of Oregon policy? Because at this point, I guess at this point, until the money goes away, nobody thinks it's real. Maybe that's what's going on.
I think that's it, and it's going to take really yanking the chain, and it's after these investigations. The first option they have is to pull federal funding. If they don't pull the federal funding, another option is to kick it to Department of Justice, when you will suddenly have Pam Bondi knocking on your door and saying, we will see you in court for violation of federal civil rights law.
All right. Sarah Parshall Perry, Vice President and Legal Fellow at Parents Defending Education, defendinged.org.